Disrespect turns to panic. Cop laughs at black general. Then he dials one number. The morning light filtered through the dusty windows of the Jefferson County Courthouse. An old building with weathered stone and creaky wooden floors, it stood like a monument to tradition. Some good, some rotten. Inside, the hallway bustled with lawyers, defendants, and law enforcement officers who had all grown used to the rhythm of routine hearings. Officer Rick Halpern leaned against a bench just outside courtroom 2B, arms folded, a smug grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. With his aviator sunglasses still perched on his forehead and a disposable coffee cup in hand, he looked every bit the small-town cop who knew his power extended beyond his badge. At 45, he had spent more than 2 decades on the force, climbing the ranks in the same town he grew up in. He knew the names of every judge, every bailiff, every prosecutor, and they knew his. Rick liked to watch the morning defendants enter the courtroom. Most were black or Latino, the usual suspects for traffic citations, expired tags, or small-time misdemeanors. And he made sure to let them know where they stood. Better wear your Sunday best, Jermaine. He smirked at one young man. Wouldn't want the judge to think you just walked out of juvie. Jermaine rolled his eyes but kept walking. The game was always the same. Mockery, control, humiliation. It wasn't about justice. It was about reminding people who had power. As the morning hearings progressed, Rick stood tall as each of his issued citations was called up. He watched defendants squirm, offer weak excuses, or plead guilty to avoid further trouble. But something changed just before noon. A man walked into the courtroom. Tall, commanding, dressed in a finely pressed dark blue suit. He moved with precision, posture upright, expression composed. His skin was deep brown, smooth-shaven, his short hair neatly trimmed. His eyes, though calm, bore the wear of experience. The kind you get from leading men in foreign lands and surviving places the rest of the world only saw on news headlines. Rick squinted, trying to place him. He didn't look like any of the usual defendants. But when the clerk announced the next case, Case 432C, State of Georgia vs. Marcus R. Bennett, Rick nearly choked on his coffee. "Wait, Bennett," he muttered. He dug into his pocket and pulled out a small notepad. Yep, he had issued a citation to someone named Marcus Bennett 2 months ago. Speeding, 45 in a 30 zone, no big deal. He barely remembered the interaction. The man had handed over his license and insurance without fuss. He didn't say much. No attitude, no fight. Rick snorted. Even fancy black folks break the law," he said under his breath, just loud enough for the court reporter beside him to hear. The courtroom doors closed behind Marcus as he took his place at the defendant's table. No lawyer. Just him. Judge Calvin Derricks looked up from his bench, eyebrow raised. "You here to represent yourself, Mr. Bennett?" he asked. "Yes, Your Honor," Marcus said in a deep, measured tone. "This should be brief." Rick chuckled and shook his head. "Arrogant," he muttered. "That's how they get when they think they're above the law." The judge scanned the file, then glanced at the citation again. His eyes shifted, slightly confused. This citation was for excessive speed in a school zone, but the officer made no note of any children present. "Mr. Bennett, do you have anything to say before I ask Officer Halpern to testify?" Marcus remained still, hands folded on the table. "Yes, Your Honor. But I'd prefer to speak after Officer Halpern." Rick stepped forward. "Time to perform." "Your Honor," he said with a smirk, "hold the date in question. I observed a black BMW sedan traveling at approximately 45 miles per hour in a 30-mile-per-hour zone. I pulled the vehicle over and identified the driver as Mr. Marcus Bennett. He was compliant but offered no explanation for his speed. I issued a citation accordingly." The judge nodded slowly. "And this occurred near Jefferson Middle School?" "Yes, sir. Just down the street from the south entrance." "Were there children present?" "Not at the time," Rick admitted. "It was about 7:40 a.m. No students had arrived yet. But it's still considered a school zone during those hours." The judge scribbled something. "All right. Mr. Bennett, your turn." Marcus stood. He didn't raise his voice or flash credentials. He didn't have to. His presence alone shifted the atmosphere. "Your Honor, I acknowledge the school zone speed limit. However, I would like to enter into evidence dashcam footage that contradicts the officer's claims." He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a USB drive, handing it to the court clerk. "Additionally," he continued, "I'd like the court to know that I am a lieutenant general in the United States Army. On the date in question, I was en route to Fort Benning for a classified military briefing. I was driving a government-issued vehicle, and my orders were time-sensitive. My driver was sick that morning, so Druck's jaw tensed. That wasn't in the report." Judge Derricks blinked in surprise. "General." "Yes, Your Honor. I did not disclose this during the stop because I did not wish to be treated differently. However, I now see that silence can be misinterpreted." Rick scoffed. "Oh, come on," he muttered loudly, earning a glance from the bailiff. "I have further evidence, Your Honor," Marcus added, returning to his seat. "But first, I need to make a brief phone call. With your permission." "A phone call?" the judge asked, confused. "To whom?" Marcus looked directly at Officer Halpern. "To someone who can clarify my role and verify what I'm saying." The courtroom fell into an eerie silence. Even the hum of the AC seemed to pause. Rick laughed out loud. "A phone call? You think someone's gonna?" But Marcus had already pulled out his phone and was dialing. He stepped into the hallway with permission. The courtroom doors creaked shut behind him, and that was when things changed. The phone call Marcus made was brief, precise, and eerily calm. As he stepped into the hallway, the sound of the courtroom muffled behind the doors, he dialed a number with the mechanical certainty of a man who had made the same call 100 times before. The line connected. "This is Lieutenant General Marcus Bennett, ID 283R. I need verification of federal travel orders on the date of March 19th and expedited contact with JAG, Military Legal Affairs." There was a pause. A respectful voice on the other end responded, "Yes, General." "One moment." Within seconds, the gears of the Pentagon began to move. While the courtroom on the other side of the wall still thought it was handling a simple traffic ticket, Marcus had just awakened a network that stretched across departments, spanning intelligence, operations, and legal authorities. He ended the call after providing a case number and an address: Jefferson County Courthouse, Georgia. Courtroom 2B. Then he walked back inside with the same unhurried poise that marked his every movement. Inside, Officer Rick Halpern was still laughing to himself. "A general," he whispered sarcastically to a bailiff. "Yeah, and I'm a 4-star chef at the White House." The bailiff didn't reply. Judge Derricks looked up as Marcus returned to his seat. "Everything all right, Mr. Bennett?" Marcus nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to proceed with the presentation of evidence." The judge gestured to the clerk, who had successfully connected the USB drive Marcus provided to the courtroom monitor. The screen flickered, and high-resolution dashcam footage appeared. It was clear, time-stamped, and unmistakable. It showed Marcus driving through the designated area at exactly 30 miles per hour, never once exceeding the limit. More importantly, the footage panned to the left side of the road, revealing flashing school zone signs covered with temporary orange bags, meaning the zone was inactive at the time. A murmur swept through the courtroom. The prosecutor leaned forward, eyes narrowing. The judge sat up straighter, his pen halting in midair. Marcus calmly narrated, "As you can see, the posted signage was covered. According to Georgia Traffic Code, this indicates a non-active school zone. Furthermore, I contacted the school board and obtained documentation that school was not in session that week due to spring break. I also have a notarized affidavit from the principal confirming no students or staff were present at the time." He slid another folder across the table toward the clerk. Judge Derricks took the affidavit, scanned it, and sighed. "This is compelling evidence, Mr. Bennett. Officer Halpern, do you have anything to say in response?" Rick shifted uncomfortably in his seat. That's not what I remember. The signs weren't covered when I drove through earlier that day." The judge leaned forward. "You included no photographs in your report, Officer Halpern. No dashcam footage from your patrol vehicle. Not even a time-stamped GPS log. Do you have any corroborating evidence?" Rick's lips pressed into a thin line. "No, sir." Marcus spoke again, calmly. "Additionally, Your Honor, I believe it is worth mentioning that Officer Halpern's report included several inconsistencies. He misidentified the make of my vehicle, stating it was a black BMW sedan. It was a government-issued black Chevrolet Suburban. The license plate listed on the citation matches a Department of Defense vehicle." A heavy pause blanketed the courtroom. Judge Derricks rubbed his temple. "This is extremely concerning." The Rick felt the sweat prickling at the back of his neck. The smirk that had carried him through a decade of casual courtroom mockery was gone. He shifted in his seat, now fully aware that this wasn't a typical defendant, and this wasn't going to end the way he expected. The courtroom doors creaked open again. Everyone turned. 2 men in dark blue uniforms walked in. United States Army service uniforms, polished to perfection. Their boots echoed across the wooden floor as they approached the bench. One of them, a colonel, saluted Marcus immediately. "General Bennett," he said firmly. "We were dispatched by Fort Benning Command per your call." Marcus stood and returned the salute. "Thank you, Colonel." Judge Derricks looked between them, stunned. "What is the meaning of this?" The colonel spoke respectfully but clearly. "Sir, we were asked to observe these proceedings to ensure compliance with the rights and protections afforded to a high-ranking officer of the United States military. We have also alerted the Judge Advocate General's office for any necessary legal action arising from misconduct or unlawful treatment of General Bennett. Rick's breath caught in his throat. The judge blinked several times. Is that really necessary? The colonel nodded. Under Title 10 of the U.S. Code, any official misconduct that impedes a general officer's duty or falsely accuses said officer while in active service is subject to federal review. Rick took a step back. Marcus sat calmly, never raising his voice. Your Honor, I have great respect for this court, and I did not wish for any of this to escalate. But this is not the first time I've encountered Officer Halpern's bias. On the day of the stop, he asked me why a man like me would be driving a government vehicle. When I handed him my ID, he looked at it and said, "You people always have a story." That, I did not mention in my report. But I remember it. The judge's face hardened. He turned to Rick. Is that true? Rick's face flushed. He's lying. I never said that. Marcus didn't flinch. It's not just my word. The dash cam also records audio. Everyone turned to the screen again. The footage resumed. Rick's voice played clearly. Why would someone like you be driving a government vehicle? Another pause, then. You people always have a story. The room went dead silent. Judge Derrick stared at Rick. You filed this report under oath. Rick said nothing. The prosecutor stood up, buttoning his blazer. Your Honor, the state would like to motion for dismissal of the charges, with prejudice. And I recommend this transcript be forwarded to Internal Affairs. Judge Derrick nodded slowly. So ordered. Case dismissed, with prejudice. Marcus stood, nodded at the judge, and turned to leave. But the judge wasn't done. Officer Halpern remained behind. We'll be discussing your future on the force, immediately. Marcus walked past Rick without looking at him. Outside, the colonel and the captain accompanied Marcus down the courthouse steps. A few local reporters had gathered, curious about the military vehicles now parked outside. One of them, a young black woman from the Jefferson County Sentinel, ran up with a microphone. General Bennett, can I ask? What just happened in that courtroom? Marcus adjusted his cufflinks, glanced back at the courthouse briefly, then faced her. Justice happened. Eventually. She smiled slightly. Would you like to comment on the officer's actions? Marcus paused. No. I'll let the footage speak for itself. Then he walked to the waiting vehicle, flanked by military escorts, and disappeared into the black Suburban that Officer Halpern had failed to identify. Inside the courthouse, Rick sat alone in the courtroom as the judge summoned representatives from Internal Affairs. He wasn't laughing anymore. The courthouse hallway was quieter than usual. It wasn't the usual hush of lawyers whispering legalese or nervous defendants awaiting their turn. It was the kind of silence that descends when something larger is brewing beneath the surface, like thunder rolling in behind the clouds. General Marcus Bennett walked calmly down the corridor, flanked by two uniformed officers who shadowed his every step like sentinels. Inside the courtroom, the quiet was more uncomfortable than reverent. Judge Derrick sat still behind the bench, his fingers steepled in front of his mouth. The prosecutor, District Attorney Evelyn Glass, remained seated, unusually subdued. Officer Rick Halpern stood near the witness box, his posture stiff, his breathing shallow. Every second ticked like a drumbeat toward reckoning. The judge finally spoke, his voice low and deliberate. Officer Halpern, the court has reviewed damning evidence. Verifiable audio and video contradicting your report and exposing racial bias during a stop involving a decorated United States Army general. Rick opened his mouth, then closed it again. I'll remind you, Judge Derrick continued, you're under oath. You were under oath when you submitted your report. Perjury, false reporting, and civil rights violations are not minor infractions in this court. I didn't. Rick began, but the judge raised his hand. Don't. I don't want excuses. Not today. The judge turned to the bailiff. Clear the courtroom. We're moving into closed session. Spectators and lesser court personnel were ushered out. Reporters banged on the glass doors outside, some still typing furious updates into their phones. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the staff complied with the judge's orders. No one was there to defend him. No attorney. No police union representative. No partner. For the first time in years, he stood exposed. The judge glanced at DA Evelyn Glass. Ms. Glass, I assume you're opening an official inquiry. She nodded. Effective immediately. We will begin with an internal review and pass the findings to the State Attorney General. There may also be a federal component, given General Bennett's rank and the potential violation of federal protections. Rick could barely hear her. His thoughts swirled. It was just a stop. That's what he kept telling himself. Just another guy in another car. Another ticket. Another box checked. So why did this one unravel everything? Maybe it was because Marcus Bennett didn't react like the others. He didn't curse, didn't shout, didn't even glare. He'd just complied. And that terrified Rick more than anything. Because power, when calm, is terrifying. Downstairs in a conference room turned temporary military operations center, Marcus sat at the end of a long table. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were focused. Colonel Jared Tannenbaum stood beside him, sorting through documents and contact memos sent from Fort Benning. Across from them sat JAG Officer Captain Marissa Lane, legal advisor and longtime friend of Marcus. "Are you sure you want to pursue the full review?" she asked gently. "There are other ways to handle this quietly." Marcus took a breath. "It's not about revenge, Rissa. It's about pattern. If he did it to me, with cameras rolling, imagine what he's done to young black kids without any protection. Someone needs to audit his entire career." Lane nodded, already opening a laptop. "We've pulled the past 10 years of citations and stops. Preliminary numbers show a 78% citation rate for black drivers, in a county where they make up only 24% of the population." "Jesus," Tannenbaum muttered. "That's the part they always overlook," Marcus said. "Not the racism that makes headlines. The racism that hides in clipboards, patrol logs, body language. The kind you can't call out unless you're holding hard evidence in your hand." A Captain Lane typed rapidly. "We'll coordinate with DOJ Civil Rights. Internal affairs will probably stall. But now that the footage is public, they don't have much ground." "What about the local press?" Marcus asked. "They're already running the headline," Lane replied. "Army General dismantles cops' racist lies in court." She paused, looked up. "That okay with you?" Marcus didn't flinch. "Truth doesn't require my permission." Back in Courtroom 2B, Rick Halpern was sweating. He sat alone now, a cold glass of water sweating on the table in front of him. The judge had retired to chambers temporarily, and the DA had stepped out to receive a secure call from the state AG's office. Rick stared at the courtroom door as if expecting someone, anyone, to burst in and say this was all a misunderstanding. But no one came. He replayed the moment in his mind. March 19th. He had clocked the Suburban going a little fast and decided to pull it over. Not because it was reckless. Not because of danger. Just because. It wasn't personal, he told himself. He'd made thousands of stops. Some people looked nervous. Some got mouthy. Some got out of line. And some, like Bennett, were too quiet. Too sure of themselves. That's what did it, Rick thought bitterly. He looked at me like I was irrelevant. And now he was facing suspension, a possible firing, and a potential federal investigation. All because of one man. One call. No, he corrected himself. Not because of the call, because of the truth. Upstairs, Marcus received a call from the Pentagon directly. "General Bennett," said the voice on the secure line. "We're monitoring the case. Civilian oversight and DOD legal are fully briefed. You'll be given support at every level." "I appreciate that, sir. We also understand you've requested a deeper inquiry into racial profiling. We're authorizing the release of a report on systemic bias in local jurisdictions, using this case as a case study, if you're willing." Marcus was quiet for a beat. "I am." He ended the call and looked at his colleagues. "This isn't just about me anymore." By the next morning, the story had exploded. Major news networks ran the footage on Lupa.com, composed black general exposing a racist cop with quiet efficiency. The clip of Rick saying, "You people always have a story," went viral. Hashtags trended General Bennett, Faye Bisonblue, Feck Silent Power. Rick's name was everywhere. By 10 a.m., he had been placed on paid administrative leave. By noon, the DOJ had requested his complete record, including body cam footage, citation logs, and internal conduct reviews. Anonymous whistleblowers began contacting the press with stories of Rick's misconduct stretching back 10 years. One woman, a retired teacher, said Rick once pulled her over and asked her if the car was really hers. Another young man claimed Rick accused him of carrying drugs when all he had was a gym bag. The stories poured out like floodwaters behind a broken dam. Rick stayed home, blinds drawn, phone off, his voicemail was full. His union rep wouldn't return his calls. At the same time, the Jefferson County Courthouse received a phone call from the governor's office. They wanted a briefing. They wanted answers. And they wanted to know who was in charge of ensuring it never happened again. Judge Derricks, for his part, issued a rare public statement. The court deeply regrets the treatment of General Marcus R. Bennett and acknowledges the systemic issues that enabled this misconduct. We are cooperating fully with federal authorities. Justice must not only be fair, it must be seen to be fair. At a quiet restaurant in Atlanta, Marcus met with his daughter Naima. She was 26, sharp-tongued, and unapologetically political. As they sipped coffee, she looked him square in the eyes. "Dad, are you okay?" He nodded. "I've had worse, sir," she said. "But not in uniform. Not at home." Marcus looked out the window, watching cars glide down Peachtree Street. "That's the part that stings," he admitted. "I've led men through hell. I've briefed presidents, I've buried soldiers. But a man with a badge thought I was beneath him the moment he saw my skin. Naima put her hand on his. And you taught him otherwise? He smiled faintly. No, I let the truth teach him. Naima leaned back. Good, because there's a whole generation out here that needs to know truth still matters. And that we've got generals walking among us. Marcus raised his cup in quiet salute. To walking with dignity. She clinked her cup with his. To dismantling systems. With poise. The skies over Fort Benning were gray that morning. Thick clouds rolling across Georgia like smoke signals from a distant battlefield. Inside the base, General Marcus Bennett stood in front of a large glass window overlooking the parade field, hands clasped behind his back. He wasn't looking at the soldiers drilling below. He was waiting. At exactly 800 a.m. his phone buzzed with a secure call. He answered. Bennett. A calm, deliberate voice spoke on the other end. General, this is Deputy Director Amy Salazar, Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. Good morning, Director. I'll be brief. We're initiating a federal civil rights investigation into Officer Richard Halpern and the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department. We'd like your formal statement on the incident. Not just the traffic stop, but any interaction that might indicate a pattern of institutional misconduct. Marcus didn't miss a beat. You'll have it within the hour. My legal advisor is already compiling the timeline. We'd also like your cooperation on a broader review. We're launching an initiative targeting racial bias in rural and suburban law enforcement agencies. You're the highest-ranking African-American officer to be directly affected in a documented civilian law enforcement incident. Marcus was silent. Then, are you asking me to become a symbol? We're asking you to lend your credibility to a cause that matters. People are paying attention. This is bigger than one courtroom. He looked back out the window at his soldiers. Then I'm in, he said. But I'll do it my way. Later that day, in a conference room filled with senior officers, JAG officials, and public relations staff, Marcus outlined his plan. We're not waging a war, he began. We're exposing a pattern. Quietly, professionally, with facts and evidence. I want full records on Officer Halpern, not just from his current department, but any previous postings. Use FOI requests. Dig through complaint histories. Interview former supervisors and citizens. If there's a trail, we'll find it. Captain Marissa Lane nodded. We've already found 4 formal complaints filed against him in the last decade. 2 of them were buried in arbitration, 1 was dismissed, and 1 just disappeared. Find the people who filed those complaints. Marcus said. See if they're willing to talk. Tannenbaum, standing by the whiteboard, added. We've also pulled citation logs. His stop and ticket ratio for black drivers is more than triple the department average. No body cam footage for 60% of those stops. Marcus leaned back in his chair. Then we build the case. Not just to punish him, but to reveal how many cracks in the system let him survive this long. Should we notify the press? Lane asked. Not yet. Marcus replied. The moment this becomes about headlines, it becomes a game. And I don't play games with justice. At the same time, 140 miles away in Jefferson County, Officer Halpern was pacing in his living room. His front porch had been vandalized the night before, spray paint in bold black letters, ACCUNT. A window had been cracked. The department offered him low-profile protection, which meant an unmarked car idling at the end of the block. Inside, Rick was unraveling. He'd received 3 subpoenas in 2 days, DOJ Internal Affairs, and a civil suit from General Bennett's legal team. Every time his phone rang, he flinched. He turned on the TV. Every channel was playing some variation of the story. CNN had run an op-ed titled, "The General vs. the Badge Race Rank and Respect in America." MSNBC had featured clips of other veterans recalling similar encounters. Even Fox News had weighed in, though their framing was more hostile, questioning whether the general had used his rank as a weapon. Rick hurled the remote at the wall, but it wasn't just the media. The real storm came from inside. His wife had taken the kids and gone to her sister's. His police union rep had advised him to resign, and his own department had frozen his access to internal systems. He was a ghost in the force he once wielded like a hammer. That afternoon, his lawyer called. "You're being made the example," the lawyer said bluntly. "You're going to take the fall for every buried complaint and overlooked stop in that department. Then fight back." Rick growled. "I'm not going down for doing my job." The lawyer sighed. "Your job wasn't to lie on a report or make racist remarks with a live mic. There's no defense for what you did. You can either cooperate and settle, or risk indictment." Rick sat in silence. Outside, the thunder finally broke. Rain lashed the windows. His world was closing in. Back at Fort Benning, Marcus received a call that stopped him cold. "Sir," said Captain Lane, walking into his office. You're going to want to take this privately. Line 3. He picked up. Bennett. Sir, this is Malik Thompson, said a young voice on the other end. You don't know me, but Halpern arrested me when I was 17. Said I looked like someone who'd broken into a store down the street. I'd never even been arrested before. I had no record. Marcus listened silently. I spent 2 nights in holding. Missed my scholarship interview. I never went to college. That stop changed my whole life. My mom told me what you did in court. Thank you. Marcus's grip on the phone tightened. Malik, he said softly, would you be willing to speak on the record? Yes, sir. I'll say whatever I have to. By week's end, Marcus's team had compiled a 47-page dossier documenting Officer Halpern's career of misconduct, verified racial disparities and buried complaints. The DOJ had opened formal proceedings. The state AG's office issued a public statement acknowledging the case as an example of the urgent need for law enforcement reform. And then, on a Friday afternoon filled with rain, the real call came. From the White House. A private line. General Bennett, said the President's Chief of Staff, the President would like to commend your poise and leadership. We're launching a federal working group on equity in law enforcement, and he'd like you to serve as a senior advisor. Civil, military liaison. Marcus didn't speak right away. He thought about that courtroom. That smirk, that assumption. He thought about Malik Thompson. About the teacher who'd been humiliated. About the hundreds of quiet victims who never had a dash cam or a rank or a voice. Then he said, tell the President I accept. The storm was no longer coming. It was here, and Marcus Bennett was at the center. Not as a victim, not as a symbol, but as a force. A quiet, calm force. The kind you never see coming until everything changes. The ripple started small. A tweet from a student activist at Georgia State. If a general can be profiled, what happens to the rest of us? A comment on a local news page from an elderly black man in Jefferson County. Halpern pulled me over in U6. I still remember how he grinned when he made me sit on the curb. A message sent privately to Captain Marissa Lane's secure inbox. I worked under Halpern. I couldn't speak up back then. I'm ready now. By the end of the week there were more than 300 unique submissions, stories, tips, files. Some anonymous. Some raw and handwritten. All echoing the same refrain, it wasn't just one cop. And just like that, the storm Marcus Bennett had refused to unleash publicly had started to roar all on its own. The department shakes. The Jefferson County Sheriff's Office was in panic mode. Sheriff Calvin Doyle sat in his office, 2 fingers pinching the bridge of his nose. The Internal Affairs report sat thick on his desk, damning in both volume and content. Rick Halpern was only the tip of the iceberg. The numbers were indisputable. Over 14 years, Halpern had issued nearly 3,000 citations, 340 of them to black or Latino individuals. His use of force incidents were triple the department average. Complaints about unprofessional behavior had been quietly dismissed or resolved internally, often without follow-up. And then there was the locker room footage. Pulled from a forgotten maintenance camera in the precinct's old annex. It showed Halpern laughing with another officer, mimicking military types, and referring to uppity ones in uniform. He saluted me like I should salute him back. Halpern had said on the footage. Probably wipes his boots with the flag when no one's looking. Sheriff Doyle knew it was over. Not just for Halpern, but for himself. He was the one who'd signed off on the dismissals. The one who'd buried complaints in red tape. He thought he was protecting the department. But what he'd really protected was rot. At 10:34 a.m., he called the governor's office. I'm stepping down, he said. Effective immediately. The media turns mainstream media began shifting tone quickly. What began as a sensational courtroom clip evolved into a full investigative series. National outlets launched dedicated reporting teams to Jefferson County. Journalists dug into patterns of abuse, tracing a web of similar cases across state lines. Police departments in nearby counties were suddenly auditing their own stop records. And everywhere, Marcus Bennett's name came up. Not in dramatized hero worship, but as a catalyst. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't threatened. He hadn't even pressed charges. He had just made one phone call. And the system had begun to buckle. Interviews aired featuring young men who'd had their lives derailed by traffic stops. Mothers who watched their sons turned into statistics. Veterans, white, black, and brown. Who all asked the same thing: if this can happen to a general, what protections do the rest of us have? And more importantly, why has it taken this long for anyone to listen? Marcus goes public. Marcus Bennett was not a man who enjoyed cameras. He preferred facts to fanfare. But now requests were pouring in. From universities, congressional committees, media outlets, think tanks. Some wanted him to lead panels. All wanted to turn his silence into sound bites. He declined most of them. Except one. PBS Frontline. They agreed to his terms: no dramatization, no personal fluff, no courage under fire narrative. Just facts, the footage, the systemic analysis. And the truth. The hour-long episode aired nationwide. In it, Marcus walked the cameras through each document, each data point. "I'm not special," he said quietly into the camera. "The only thing that saved me was a badge of a different kind. And the eyes watching. But there are thousands of young black men who will never get that second chance. Not because they did something wrong, but because someone else decided they didn't belong." The documentary ended not with a gavel or a resignation, but with Marcus standing in uniform, staring at a wall of names fallen soldiers. Beneath it, a simple quote: "We ask men and women to serve their country, but do we serve them when they come home?" Halpern faces the music. Rick Halpern sat in the courtroom again. This time, he was the defendant. A federal civil rights trial had been approved. The evidence wasn't just damning, it was comprehensive. Dozens of testimonies, video clips, internal memos, even fellow officers taking the stand. The public defender he'd finally hired was competent but overwhelmed. The prosecutor's final statement was brutal. "Officer Halpern's record is not an anomaly. It's an instruction manual for how to get away with racism in a badge. He stopped people not based on behavior, but identity. He lied on reports, he taunted victims, and he underestimated the man who finally exposed him." Rick sat still, his hands clenched. The jury deliberated for just under 4 hours. The verdict: guilty. On all counts. Sentencing was scheduled for the following month. But the fallout was immediate. The department announced sweeping reforms. Independent oversight commissions were created. And Halpern's case became mandatory curriculum at the police academy. Chain reaction spreads. What happened next no one predicted. Following DOJ recommendations, several counties across the U.S. began opening similar inquiries into profiling patterns, arrest logs, and complaint handling. In Louisiana, a sergeant resigned after body cam footage revealed coercive tactics during a traffic stop. In Ohio, a sheriff's office was found to have intentionally discarded video evidence of racial slurs during arrests. In Arizona, a black firefighter came forward about a stop that nearly ended his career. Just days after seeing Marcus Bennett's interview, even Congress responded. A bipartisan bill, the Uniform Accountability and Justice Act, was introduced, mandating federal review of any law enforcement misconduct case involving military veterans. It wasn't sweeping reform, but it was movement. And it all traced back to that one phone call. Naima speaks out at Spelman College. Naima Bennett stood at the podium. She had just been invited to give the keynote speech for the Social Justice and Law Symposium. As she looked out at the sea of young black and brown faces, she felt her throat tighten. "My father taught me that silence can be powerful, but it should never be mistaken for acceptance," she began. He didn't raise his voice when that officer laughed at him. He didn't shout or threaten. He picked up the phone. And that call did more than expose one man. It showed the cracks in a whole system. She paused. "You don't need a uniform to change things. You need courage, precision, and people who believe that truth is louder than hate." Thunderous applause followed, but Naima wasn't finished. "I used to resent my dad's restraint," she said softly. "Now I understand it, because the calmest storms change the most." The last conversation 2 weeks later, Rick Halpern sat alone in a prison holding cell awaiting transfer. He heard the door buzz. A guard appeared. "You've got a visitor." Rick blinked. "I didn't request one." "You didn't have to." When he walked into the visitation room, Marcus Bennett stood behind the glass, phone in hand. Rick sat down slowly. They didn't speak for a moment. Then Rick picked up the phone. "Why are you here?" Marcus's face was unreadable. "Because no one learns anything if we leave it all behind." Rick's eyes narrowed. "You came to gloat." "No," Marcus replied. "I came to remind you that accountability isn't the end. It's the beginning. What you do next matters, even here. Who you become next matters." Rick shook his head. "You're not responsible for me." "No," Marcus said. "But I am responsible for what comes after, for making sure this never happens again. To anyone." He hung up the phone and stood. Rick stared after him, alone again. Marcus Bennett walked out of the prison and into the light. Outside, a journalist asked, "General, do you believe justice was served?" He paused, then said no. "But justice has finally begun." The rot had been exposed, the gavel had struck, and the chains had begun to fall. But Marcus Bennett knew the work wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because while the world now understood the depth of the wound, real healing would take something deeper. Accountability had lit the match. Now came the fire that forged change. Returned to the field, Fort Benning was alive with its usual rhythm. Boots pounding pavement, cadence calls echoing through the dawn. But for the first time in weeks, General Bennett wasn't in a war room or on a call with Washington. He was out with his troops. You ready to run with us, sir? One young lieutenant asked, grinning as he jogged in place. Only if you're ready to be passed. Marcus shot back with a smirk. As they began their 5-mile loop, soldiers glanced sideways at him. He knew what they were thinking. Not long ago, their CO had gone from battlefield leader to national headline. Yet here he was. No cameras, no podium, just a soldier among soldiers. At the water break, a corporal hesitated before speaking. Sir, I just wanted to say thank you. Marcus raised an eyebrow. For what? For not letting them treat your rank like a target. For showing us we don't have to accept it. Marcus nodded once. No one gets to decide your value, he said. Not a badge, not a bench, not a uniform. You do. The group fell silent. But the weight of that lesson ran deeper than any mile marker. Building from the ashes in Washington, policy wheels were turning. The Uniform Accountability and Justice Act, now dubbed the Bennett Bill by the press, had cleared committee with bipartisan support. While it didn't dismantle every structural issue, it did make 4 key reforms mandatory: federal oversight for local departments where veterans filed civil rights complaints, automatic DOJ review when officers had 3 or more racial bias allegations, civilian military liaisons appointed in state law enforcement boards, a national misconduct registry, preventing bad officers from hopping state lines. Marcus had testified quietly behind closed doors, no fanfare, no cameras. He had insisted on it. I'm not interested in being a political tool, he told the committee. I'm interested in being a hammer to the wall they keep building around truth. Still, his voice carried weight. His words made it into congressional records. Law students studied his case, and civil rights groups began organizing legal toolkits based on the dossier his team built. One phone call had turned into a blueprint for reform. Naima's letter. Late one evening, Marcus returned home to find an envelope on his desk. It was handwritten, thick with folded papers. Naima's handwriting. Dad, it began. I spent most of my childhood watching you disappear into duty. I knew you were a soldier before I ever understood what it meant. I used to wonder if I'd ever measure up. Not to your rank but to your silence. But after what happened, after how you handled it, I finally understand. You weren't silent because you didn't care. You were silent because you were listening. Because sometimes the most dangerous lie is the one no one hears being told. Inside the envelope were dozens of small notes, each one transcribed from emails and DMs she'd receive. I stood up to a racist boss today. Your father gave me the courage. I filed a complaint with our city PD. Because if a general can do it, so can I. Your dad didn't just fight for himself. He fought for all of us. Tears welled in Marcus's eyes as he read each one. He never set out to inspire anyone. But somehow, in fighting for his own dignity, he had helped restore the dignity of thousands. The promotion. 2 months later, Marcus stood in front of the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, dressed in full dress uniform. Dozens of flags lined the corridor, representing each military branch. General Marcus Bennett, the Secretary of Defense, announced, in recognition of exemplary service, valor in leadership, and unwavering integrity under scrutiny, you are hereby promoted to Lieutenant General. A second star was pinned on his shoulder. It gleamed like a beacon. But the real honor came after the ceremony. As he shook hands with officers and dignitaries, a quiet figure approached. An older woman, clutching a faded picture of a young black man in a Navy uniform. My son was stopped too, she said softly. Back in '93, they said he resisted. But he didn't. We never got justice, until now. Marcus bowed his head and took the photo gently. Tell me his name, he said. Isaiah. I'll remember it, Marcus replied. He matters. In that moment, no stars, medals, or speeches could compare. Halpern's last statement from inside a federal facility in North Carolina. Rick Halpern requested one last hearing. Not to appeal, but to testify. In a rare move, he was allowed to speak via video to a panel reviewing systemic abuse in law enforcement. I don't expect forgiveness, he said, his voice gravelly. But I see it now. I see the system that made me think I had the right to humiliate someone like General Bennett. It wasn't just me. It was the locker room laughs. The ignored complaints. The way we were trained to see some people as threats before they spoke a word. He looked directly into the camera. I didn't see a general. I saw what I wanted to see, and that's the most dangerous blindness of all. His words were met with silence. Not because they lacked power, but because they came too late. Still, the panel included his statement in their final report. Even a rotten voice can echo truth in the end. A new command. Marcus Bennett received orders to head a newly created unit, the Military Justice Equity Command (MJEC). It would be a multi-branch task force operating within the Pentagon, bridging the gap between military service and civilian law enforcement reform. Its mission: identify racial disparities, propose solutions, and train leaders across institutions. His first action: recruiting officers who had lived through similar moments of injustice, veterans who'd once been dismissed, women and men of color with scars and service records alike. He made Nema his civilian advisor. Together they rewrote protocols, proposed reforms, and traveled the country, speaking not just to power but to people. Homecoming one sunny morning, Marcus returned to the courtroom in Jefferson County. Not in uniform, not under subpoena. He walked through the same metal detectors, nodded to the same bailiff, and entered the same courtroom. This time, as a guest speaker at a law enforcement reform symposium. "I'm not here to relive what happened," he said, standing at the same spot where Halpern once sneered. "I'm here to prove that change doesn't just come from justice. It comes from memory. From refusing to forget." He looked out at the young cadets, officers, and lawyers watching him. "The question isn't whether you'll face injustice," he said. "The question is what you'll do when you do. Will you laugh, will you look away, or will you make the call?" Silence filled the room, and then, applause. Not thunderous, but deep. True. 1 year later, on the anniversary of the court incident, Marcus stood quietly outside the Jefferson County Courthouse. No cameras, no press, just him. He dialed a number. Not to the Doge, not to the media, to a young man named Malik Thompson. "You still planning on college?" Marcus asked. Malik laughed. "Accepted to Georgia Tech last week. Studying a recommendation?" Marcus asked. "Already got yours framed." They both laughed. Then, before hanging up, Marcus said, "Just remember, the system doesn't break overnight. But sometimes all it takes is one phone call to start the fall." A year passed. Then another. The courtroom incident that once dominated national headlines faded from breaking news cycles. But the ripple effects, they never stopped. A new class of police cadets was sworn in under reform policies influenced by the Bennett Bill. Nema published her first book, Uniform and Unseen, The Stories Behind the Stops, now taught in universities nationwide. Community police forums, once performative, were now backed by funding, oversight, and purpose. And Marcus Bennett, Lieutenant General, father, soldier, catalyst, continued to lead quietly, mentoring young leaders, advising congressional committees, and reminding institutions that true power lies not in how loud you speak, but in how deeply you listen. On a quiet evening, Marcus stood before a group of graduating ROTC cadets. The sun dipped low behind him, casting long shadows across the parade field. He removed his cap, looked each of them in the eye, and said, "History doesn't change because someone yells the loudest. It changes because someone decides they won't accept silence anymore. I didn't plan to start a movement. I just made a phone call. But what matters most isn't what I did. It's what you choose to do next. When you're tested, when the world tells you to look away, don't. Truth doesn't need a badge or a title. It just needs a voice. Let yours be one of them." The cadets stood in salute, but Marcus didn't return it immediately. He simply nodded, the kind of nod that said, "Your turn now." Moral of the story: true power doesn't lie in rank, force, or fear. It lies in integrity. When injustice shows its face, silence enables it, but action, no matter how small, can unravel an entire system. You don't need a uniform to make change. You need courage, character, and the conviction to stand even when standing alone.